to introduce Lauren. Lauren comes to us from the University of California, Irvine, where she's an associate professor of logic and philosophy of science. The trajectory that she took to get there is one of the most fascinating that I know of. She started with a bachelor's in nutrition and then trained as a medical doctor. So she's actually the only MD I know who's also a philosopher. She then went on to train and receive her PhD in the history and philosophy of science at the University of Pittsburgh under James Woodward and Kenneth Schaffner. And after a postdoc at the University of Calgary, she then went to the University of California, Irvine in 2017, where she's been since. Lauren's areas of specialty are in causation and explanation. She focuses on neuroscience, biology, and medicine. I had the great privilege to work with Lauren recently on a paper titled "A Call for More Clarity Around Causality in Neuroscience," just to point out some of the issues and some of the ways that brain researchers are a bit confused when it comes to causality. We tend to talk past one another. And one of the things that really impressed me about Lauren is the insight and the clarity that she could bring to our conversations. So we could say things that sort of half made sense when we were talking past one another. And Lauren could say, you're saying this and you're saying this. And then there was this aha moment among all of us. So I really deeply appreciated that contribution. And that experience with Lauren is one of the things that really convinced me that philosophy has a lot to offer brain research. And so to explain to you just what that is, I'm going to hand things over to Lauren. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Nicole and MindCORE, for the introduction and the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today. The title and topic of my talk today is Causal Varieties in Science, More Than Mechanisms. Causation is, let's pull this back here, a topic that receives a lot of attention and in many different fields. It receives a lot of attention in science, of course, also philosophy, legal theory, everyday life, and in many other domains. Why is this the case? Why does causation receive so much attention and in so many different fields? A first reason for this has to do with explanation. Philosophers of science and people who do theory of science often suggest that explanation is one of the most important things that scientists do. They also suggest that most explanations are causal. And the idea here is that causes explain their effects. So a scientist identifies some effect, outcome, endpoint in the world. And if they're going to explain that and provide understanding, they need to identify the main cause or set of causes.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think they need to fix something on Zoom because what they're seeing is like the whole PowerPoint and not just
the relevant screen. So I think it's just a matter of, let's see, changing which screen is being shared. Yeah, so you see that's what they're seeing. So I think maybe if we do stop share and then do the correct thing. I think we should be good now. All right, and let me go back here.
Start again for the recording. Okay. So first main reason for why there's significant interest in causation is explanation. The suggestion is that explanation is one of the most important things that scientists do. Most of them are causal. If you want to understand one of the most important things that scientists do, explanation, and many of these are causal, you need to know something about causality, of course. A second main reason for interest in causation is prediction. If you can identify genes or a main gene that causes a disease, you can use the identification of that gene to provide some indication of the likelihood that that disease will occur in an individual or a patient. A third main reason for our interest in causation is control. We don't just want to sit back and provide accurate explanations and predictions of outcomes in the world. We also want to actually do something about them. Causality is essential here because causes are factors that give control over their effects. In the context of medicine, this is essential because it allows us to provide treatments, preventions, and cures for diseases. The fourth main reason for our interest in causation is it's important for attributing responsibility and blame. We want to know what the cause of the car crash is, not just to explain it or predict future crashes, but to know who or what is responsible for this crash. Is it the driver who wasn't paying attention? Is there a manufacturing problem with the car? Is it the light signal in the road that wasn't working? In the context of philosophy of science, it's appreciated that if you want to reach these four main causation-related goals, there's a very important first step that you need to take. The very important first step is you need to define causation. You need a definition, an account, or a theory of causality. A definition of causation is going to tell you what the characteristic features of causation are. This is really important because then you can use those features to distinguish true, genuine causal relationships from everything else, from stuff that's non-causal, mere correlations, spurious correlations. We've all heard the phrase correlation isn't causation. If you want to say why that's the case, you need a definition of causation. There are many different definitions of causation in the philosophical literature. Here are three main types. We have regularity definitions of causation. These have been articulated by Hume and Mackey. We have connected process accounts of causation. Wesley Salmon has discussed these in addition to many others. And interventionist accounts are a third example. Woodward's interventionist account of causation is an example of this. What hasn't been appreciated in this literature is that if you want to reach these four main causation-related goals, you need to take this first step, but you really need a lot more. There's an important second step that you need to take if you want to reach these goals. And this involves not just defining causation, but capturing distinctions within causation. You can have causes and causal relationships that all meet the same definition, but that differ in wildly diverse and rich ways. Another way to say this is that relationships that are causal differ in really important ways, even when they meet the same definition. They have different types of features, and these features matter for causal reasoning and for these four main goals. One hint at these distinctions is the language we use to refer to causes in the world. So in scientific contexts, a common distinction that shows up is between causes that are predisposing for a disease versus exciting or triggering. Another distinction, especially in genetics, is whether a gene is a driver for a disease versus just a passenger. Very common distinction is whether causes are proximal for an outcome, they're very close to the endpoint, or distal, they're root causes, they're far back in the causal chain. And there are other distinctions that have to do with whether causes are organized on a linear chain. They can be organized in a bow tie type structure, and positive feedback loops, among many other types of topologies. And yet another set of distinctions are more complex causal systems that we find in neurobiology and biology, systems like mechanisms, pathways, and cascades. Part of what we're seeing here is causal terminology that is referring to and picking out a rich diversity of types of causes, causal relationships, and causal systems. Another way to present this is to say that the very first step, the definition of causation, it gives you a binary answer to the question, is this causal, right? Yes or no. And once you have an affirmative answer, then you can start to look at what type of causal relationship do you have, right? Looking at this diversity across types of causes. So this is what we'll be focused on today, distinctions within causation, kind of causal diversity. I'm going to use two main questions to guide this analysis. And the first question is just how do we capture these? What are common types? Maybe especially types that matter for scientific contexts, neurobiology, biology, and the life sciences. And then of course, why do they matter? Why should you care about them? So with this background in mind, the plan for the talk today comes in 3 main steps. A very first step of this talk is to just give us some examples of distinctions within causation. I'll focus on the life sciences, in particular neurobiology and biology. In the second part of this talk, I will provide an analysis or a framework for capturing these distinctions. And in the third and final part, and really peppered throughout the talk, I'll say things about why these matter, why you should care about them. I'll suggest that they have implications for causal reasoning, for causal explanation, for capturing different types of control that causes give over the world, and science communication, right? How we communicate clearly and accurately about the types of causal complexity in the world and that we study and identify in science. So let's start things off with some examples of distinctions within causation. The case study that I'll use to describe 3 different distinctions within causation here is one that comes from the context of genetics. And it's an answer to this question, how do genes cause traits? One answer to this question that we find in modern biology, modern neuroscience, is that genes, of course, produce proteins. They causally produce proteins, and in some cases, they produce enzymes. These enzymes are factors that causally produce metabolites. This is the very first step of a metabolic pathway. Metabolites are biomolecules, and in this example, we have metabolite 2. It's being produced by enzyme A, and it's also being produced by a second cause, which is metabolite 1. And of course, there's a more complex picture here with respect to how these factors are causally related. The very top here is a metabolic pathway. This is capturing a sequence of chemical conversions. You take the very first metabolite and it's chemically converted into the second, and so on down the line. You can think of the metabolic pathway as analogized to a factory assembly line where you're creating a downstream product. So if you want to build a car, you start with the frame and then you add the wheels, you add the door, you bend some stuff. Same thing is going on here. You start with glucose, add some, add a carbon, break it in half, and so on. It's being changed as it moves down the line. And this answered this question because that final metabolite can causally produce something like eye color, the hair, guinea pig coat color, something like that. So this is a basic representation of causal relationships with respect to genes, enzymes, and metabolites. This is a diagram, of course, that is representing causality. The arrows in this diagram are representing causal relationships. However, they're representing causal relationships that differ in really important ways that you don't just see with these arrows. A first difference across these causal relationships, the first distinction within causation is speed. Causes can differ with respect to the speed with which they produce their effects. If you look at the gene to enzyme causal relationship, it's one that takes place on the time scale of minutes. If you look at the enzyme to metabolite causal relationship, this takes place on the time scale of nanoseconds. An average enzyme can produce about 3 million metabolites in a single second. So that enzyme to metabolite causal relationship is very fast when you compare it to the time scale of minutes, genes to enzymes. Speed is a distinction that is always relative to a time scale of interest. So, you can't just say that a cause is fast or slow without saying what time scale you're interested in, and that's in the background. And of course, it's continuous too, right? There are different degrees of how fast or slow your causal relationship can be. And of course, we see scientists referring to this type of causality. We see this in terms of different types of control. Genes and enzymes exert their control on different timescales. Another way that we see how speed is relative to the timescale of interest is that this gene to enzyme causal relationship is very slow when you compare it to the timescale of nanoseconds. right? The enzyme to metabolite, but it's super fast if you compare it to geological processes like rock formation. And if you compare it to COVID transmission in the population, it can take place over weeks, months, super fast compared to that. So it always depends on the time scale that the scientist or the individual is interested in. Why does speed matter? Why is it something you should care about? Well, it matters for explanation. It matters for what causes you pick as the ones that are more explanatorily relevant. If you want to explain why a prey, when it's approached and frightened by a predator, is going to react in seconds and start to run away, engage in fight or flight response, you are going to appeal to the enzymes that are already present and the metabolites that are already there, because they operate at that time scale to produce that outcome. What you won't appeal to are genes. It takes them minutes to produce enzymes. They don't operate in the time scale of interest. If you want to explain something different, like why there's a pool of enzymes there in the first place, then yes, you will appeal to genes. They do operate in that time scale. So a first suggestion here is that distinctions within causation help you figure out what causes explain and which ones don't. Typically, you can background causes that are slower, that don't operate in your time scale of interest. And the time scale of interest is often baked into your explanatory target, what you want to explain in the first place. A second reason for why speed matters is control. It's giving very different types of control over the world. If you have two drugs that cause pain relief, and one of them causes pain relief in 2 minutes, and another causes pain relief in 2 hours, those are very different types of control. If you have a patient who's going to have maximum pain in 2 minutes, you'll use the first. If the pain won't come until 2 hours and you want to start the medication, you're going to use the second. Part of what this shows is that these distinctions within causation capture features of causes that are objective. The cause has this nature or this feature itself. We don't get to pick whether the cause is fast or slow. What we do get to pick is which one we target and intervene on, depending on what kind of control we want. Do you want control now? Do you want it in 2 hours? Do you want it in a week? Another reason for why speed is interesting is it matters for how scientists study causal relationships. If you're studying a causal process on the time scale of nanoseconds, you need special equipment that's able to, process and give you information at that short time scale. And if you're studying geological systems that are causal processes that take place over millions of years, as you can imagine, and maybe know, that involves its own set of challenges, or even something like COVID transmission through the population. Another reason for why speed matters is cognitive psychologists have done research that shows that humans are biased against slow causes, even when they're just as strong and just as stable as super fast ones. So if you're going to communicate a causal system to the public, and the cause is slow, something like COVID change through the population, the spread of COVID through the population, or climate change takes place on a very long time scale relative to our daily lives and the ones we might prioritize and privilege. Well, you need to know that when you're communicating this causal relationship to that audience. You need to know that they might downplay that cause inappropriately, right? This is our first distinction within causation. Here's our second. It's called material continuity. The idea here is that it captures how some causes transmit material to their effects and other causes don't. A really nice example of material continuity is the metabolic pathway at the very top of this slide. The metabolic pathway involves some starting material that has microstructure and material that reliably moves through the sequence of causal steps. It's a carbon skeleton in this case. Or if you have that factory assembly line, you have the car frame, and it's moving through the sequence of causal steps. Most causal relationships don't have material continuity. There are causal relationships that don't have material continuity. I think I'd say with confidence, most of them don't. So if you think of a sequence of dominoes that fall in succession, first domino hits the second, hits the third, and then the final one falls, that's of course a legitimate causal process. But there's no material that moves from the first domino and reliably makes its way down to the 10th or the 20th. The causes involve physical interactions, but there's no flow of material from one step to the next. Same with the gene to enzyme causal relationship. There's no reliable flow of material from one to the next. So many causal relationships don't have material continuity. Why does this matter? Well, scientists have realized in many contexts that some causes have this feature, and they've exploited it in how they study these systems. And they do this by attaching a tag or a tracer to the material, and then they watch it as it moves through the sequence of causal steps. So radioactive tags and tracers are attached to parts of a metabolite, and then you follow it as it moves through the sequence of steps. Same with ecological pathways, same with neural pathways, and many other pathways in many different contexts. But what you need in order to use these methods is material continuity. Why does this matter? Well, you can't use these methods if your causal system doesn't have this feature, and many causal systems don't have this feature. So these distinctions matter for how you study causal systems in the first place. Second set of reasons for why this matters is, again, this distinction gives you very different types of control over the world. If you want to control the microstructure of the car that you produce, whether it's made out of iron, steel, or plastic, well, you'll want to intervene on and target a cause that has material continuity to that outcome. If you want to control whether some toxin or drug makes its way into your final downstream endpoint, a great way to do that is by attaching it to a cause that has material flow or material continuity with that outcome. And of course, this matters for explanation too. Why is your car made of steel versus iron versus plastic? Well, there's a material, a cause with material continuity that has that microstructure. So it matters for explaining particular features of that outcome of interest. This is our second distinction within causation. Our third and final one here is reversibility and irreversibility. The idea is that reversible causes, as it sounds like, are ones where you can use them to undo the effect. So a really nice example of a reversible causal relationship is the light switch on the wall and the lights in the room. I can flip the switch on, turn them on, flip it off, turn them off, and I can do that again, right? This is reversible. Same with the gene to enzyme causal relationship. Gene expression can be turned on, can be turned off, can be turned on again. Some causal relationships don't have this feature, and they're irreversible in the sense that there's no way to re-intervene on the cause to restore the effect. So if I have a glass vase on this podium and I accidentally knock it over and it breaks on the floor, there's no way for me to undo the hit such that I restore the glass vase back to its original state. That's an irreversible causal relationship. The effect is permanent. There are many different examples of both of these in the life sciences. An example of an irreversible causal relationship in neuroscience and medicine are diseases that are referred to as inborn errors of metabolism. So in some cases, there's a mutation in a gene. It causes that enzyme to be non-functional. And in this context, what that means is metabolite 2 starts to accumulate because enzyme B can't convert it into metabolite 3. When metabolite 2 accumulates, in this case, it's toxic, it can cause brain damage. And even if you remove metabolite 2 and bring it back down, that brain damage can be irreversible, right? In many contexts, if you kill a cell or a neuron, you can't bring it back to life. There are many interesting examples of both types in the life sciences. Other examples of irreversible causal relationships in the life sciences are apoptosis, cell death, and the cell cycle. Also, sometimes stem cell differentiation. Once you take one step, right, there's no going back. It's irreversible. Why does this matter? Well, control. These are very different types of control over an effect and over the world. When we encounter irreversible causal relationships in everyday life, we treat them with kid gloves. We're very careful. And the reason is we don't want to accidentally trigger the cause, because if we do, the effect is permanent. So this is why we have seatbelt laws, helmet laws, poison control companies. If you damage certain parts of the body, it can be irreversible. If an individual dies, this is irreversible. Death's irreversible, so we're very careful about these situations. If the causal relationship is reversible, we're a little more cavalier about it. And as you can imagine, there are some places where you might use one or the other to get something that you want. So the toy case of a tyrant king in a village who can't stand him and they poison him and he dies. It's convenient for the village that once he dies, he can't come back to life. They don't have to worry about that, right? And you can think of other cases where having a reversible causal relationship is useful. Many machines that we use in everyday life, we want them to have that feature, right? We want our light switches to be reversible, our ovens, our cars, and many machines to have this feature too, right? And that gene to enzyme relationship, this is reversible. It's useful for the body and serving various physiological functions that it has that feature. This also matters for how we study causal relationships. You'll have to study them differently if you have a one-hit reversible causal relationship. And there are problems for assuming your relationship is reversible when it isn't. Some causal modeling techniques assume that causal relationships are reversible, and sometimes they use that to study relationships that aren't. Okay, so what have we looked at here? 3 different distinctions within causation: speed, material continuity, and reversibility. How do we understand these? How do we understand these distinctions? Part of what I'm going to suggest is that a helpful way to understand these is that they capture, a helpful way to understand these involves separating out different features of causation. So if you have a candidate causal relationship, one question you can ask about it is just, is this causal? Another question you can ask is, if it is, what further features does this causal relationship have? When you're interested in the first question, you're interested in what I'm going to call primary features of causation. Primary features of causation are features that make the relationship causal. This captures the essence of causality, or the defining features that allow you to say that this system or relationship is causal. And part of what we see is that our definitions of causation are making claims about what the primary features of causation are. So regularity accounts suggest that the primary feature of causation is a regularity. Once you find this, you've identified causation. And same with the other definitions of causation. This is what they're interested in supplying us with. If you're interested in that second question, what further features does this causal relationship have? You're interested in secondary features of causation. These are features that matter to and are relevant to the causal behavior of the system, but they don't make it causal. They're not primary features of causation. And this is where we see our distinctions within causation, whether that causal relationship is fast or slow, has material flow or not, and is reversible or not. So if you think of something like material flow, you could find material flow in the world, but it doesn't mean that you've identified a causal process or a causal relationship. You could also identify a causal relationship that doesn't have material flow. Right? Material flow isn't a primary feature of causation. We don't want to base our definition of causation on material flow. This is just an extra bell or whistle that causes can have, or causal relationships can have. It's a secondary feature of causation, right? So part of what I'm suggesting here is that a helpful way to capture this type of causal diversity in science and these distinctions within causation is to appreciate that they're secondary features of causation. They're not primary features. They don't have to do with how you define causation. They have to do with, after you've defined it, looking in that definition and appreciating different types of causes with respect to secondary features. Okay, what we can do now is use this framework to provide a kind of taxonomy for capturing different types of secondary features of causation and these distinctions within causation. So we've talked about speed, material flow, and reversibility. Other types that we find in the literature are stability, specificity, and proportionality. I mentioned linear chains, positive feedback loops, or negative bow tie type structures, and then also the mechanism, pathway, cascade, complex causal concepts. Part of what I'm going to suggest is a kind of taxonomy and classification for starting to get a handle on these and to organize them. The types in the very first column are distinctions within causation that you can see at a single causal step, the most basic unit of causation, you might think. You can see them at a single step, you can define them and describe them at a single step. They can take place across many steps, but you can see them at a single step at least. I am going to refer to these as types of causal influence because you can often associate or attach the feature with the cause itself. It has influence that is fast or slow, has material flow or not. The second set here, you can't see at a single causal step. The second type of distinctions here are ones that you can only see across multiple steps. They have to do with how causal steps are organized and arranged together, right? These are causal topologies. This is a second set of distinctions within causation. And a third are these more complex causal systems, mechanism, pathway, cascade. The third set of systems are built up out of the first two types, but they often have many other features. So this is a starting framework to use to distinguish these different types of causal diversity and distinctions within causation. Question?
Are you going to talk a little bit about what you mean by proportionality? And if not, can you tell me what you mean by it now?
I'm not going to talk about it. There is a lot of great work by Woodward and Yablo on this notion. The idea is that causes and effects should be proportional to each other. And a basic way to capture it is that if you have a gene that produces risk-taking activities, you could say the gene causes risk-taking activities or it causes bungee jumping. The idea is that you want the cause and the effect to be proportional such that they're at the same level. To say that the gene causes risk-taking activities is better and more proportional because it captures all the stuff the gene causes. It doesn't just cause bungee jumping, it could also cause, whatever, riding roller coasters every day. So that's one example of proportionality. It's probably the most tricky of these there's lots of debates about it now, but Yablo and Woodward have great work on it. What I will say a little bit more about are the mechanism, pathway, cascade concepts. If you're familiar with philosophy of neuroscience and philosophy of biology, you know this gets all of the attention. The dominant view in the field is that causal explanations in neuroscience are mechanistic, all of them. They used to say all explanations were mechanistic. Now we appreciate that there's non-causal mathematical ones, so they say all causal explanations are mechanistic. There's a ton of literature in this space. One common way that mechanism is understood is it's a causal structure with three main features. It's hierarchical, it has lower level parts that all interact together to produce an effect. You need lots of fine-grained detail. Network model, super sparse causal model won't cut it. And you need mechanical interactions, not just X causes Y, but it bends, pushes, pulls, compresses. They have motivated their framework, these philosophers of neuroscience and philosophers of biology, off of the fact that scientists use the term mechanism a lot. Of course, scientists use lots of types of causal terms, and you might think that other causal terms refer to different types of causal systems. Another term that's used frequently is the notion of a pathway. Developmental pathways, metabolic pathways, neural pathways, vascular pathways. part of what I've suggested is that a pathway is a different kind of causal structure. It has different features. Sequence of steps captures the flow of information or material, like material continuity, very abstract. You have the entire developmental pathway of a butterfly in 3 steps. And they emphasize connection. Who is connected up to who? And these are often used to provide roadmaps of connections. Here's ecological pathways, right? Part of what you can start to see is that doesn't look very much like a machine. So mechanism is analogized to a machine. Lower level parts, they all interact to produce an effect. Pathways are analogized to roadways, highways, city streets. Here's a map of connections in some domain, right? And they capture the flow through this space. Another causal concept is a cascade. We have self-signaling cascades and cascading reactions. Cascades explode. Small cause produces a huge effect. So mechanism is analogized to a machine, pathway to roadways, cascade, snowball effect, ripple effect, amplification. At the beginning of the pandemic, my university sent us out this picture that is intended to show how COVID spreads through the population. And at UC Irvine, our mascot is an anteater, and his name is Peter. So this is Peter's cautionary tale. And what this is intended to show is that one person with COVID can transmit it to 2. They can each transmit it to 2 more, and so on. And the disease amplifies through the population. If you want to communicate with this causal system, the manner of spread through the population and the fact that it amplifies in this type of way, you shouldn't call it a mechanism, right? You should call it a cascade. Cascade better captures the threat and the manner of spread of this disease, right? Very important for science communication and causal communication in general. Okay, so in conclusion, why does this matter? Honestly, it's pretty hard to think about causal reasoning and causality in the world without these distinctions. We just don't have a clear framework for keeping them separate from defining causation. More concretely, this matters for explanation. If you want to explain unique behaviors of systems, why you have a feedback loop, right? Why something amplifies in the population, appealing to distinctions within causation is essential here. It also matters for causal selection. This refers to the causes that you select as the ones that are most relevant to the outcome. The way that you sort across them and select is often on the basis of distinctions within causation, different secondary features that they have. Matters for control. That cascade gives you a very different type of control over the world than your linear chain, right? It's explosive control. Irreversible control is very different, right? That's going to allow you to create an effect that's permanent and irreversible. It's very different from one that's reversible. Matters for capturing and appreciating how scientists study causes and how you need different methods for different types of causes, causal relationships, and causal systems. You can use tracer techniques for some causal relationships, but not for others. It matters for communication about causality. Mechanism is used everywhere. I think of it as kind of it's a special word that we sometimes use to suggest that we have the real causal understanding. One problem is that it can be overly reductive and it doesn't capture this kind of diversity. So we don't want to use it for all of these systems, or we miss out on these analogies and the different types of terminology that pick up on distinctions across these types of systems. And finally, this matters for clarity about causation. Supporting clarity about causation and all of its diversity requires capturing these distinctions, how they present in the world, and the role that they should play in our causal reasoning. Thank you.
You have a slide somewhere in the middle where you're sort of dividing up like causal concepts into 3 groups. One of them was topology. Can you go back to that slide?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think you probably explained this, and I think maybe I just didn't actually didn't understand, but can you say more about what the difference is between like causal topology and causal systems is?
Yes, so, a more complex causal system like a pathway, can involve many different configurations. And if you want to appreciate the difference between these two causal systems, it's not necessarily captured at the scale of just the topology. These are really complicated. They involve lots of features, stuff from this and stuff from that, and way more. There is variety in each of these categories. This is just sheer topology. Only are you talking about a linear chain versus a bow tie structure. Sometimes there's relationships between the topologies and the pathway concept. Often there are. You can talk about the linear causal chain, and we do as pathways. Of course, they take on different configurations, branching, and so on. These are complex causal systems, and I have 2 lines here just to capture. There's a lot more involved in these. These are far easier to define. I think of these as built up out of often a topology and then lots of stuff from the first column too. But distinguishing these involves more than just distinguishing across things in any given column. And in some cases, when a scientist is providing an explanation, they don't appeal to these. They just say, hey, look, this neural system is fragile or robust because it has this topology and not another one. Or if you think of the notion of proximal and distal causes, sometimes it's just this that we're looking at. Your distal root cause is back here, and your proximal one is closer to the effect. Yeah.
So is the idea that like topology is basically just like the graph structure or something like that, whereas like the causal system, like if you want to characterize a causal system, you're going to say something about the causal topology about like the graph structure, but you're also going to say things about like speed or reversibility or things like that. Is that the idea?
Yeah, and also physical stuff, where things are located. But yeah,
Okay.
That's the idea.
I have a question from Sarah Asghari on Zoom. Could you please explain more about regularity, production, dependence? Are these distinct, sufficient definitions of a combination, or a combination of them is required for causation?
Regularity, production, and dependence. Part of what I didn't do in this talk purposefully was give a definition of causation. The one thing that's important to appreciate is that all of these we can talk about, and we haven't said anything about how to define causation, right? That's because these don't have to do with how you define causation. They have to do with something else, distinctions within it. I do think that you could capture many of these with different definitions of causation. The definition that I rely on in my work and that I think makes sense of most scientific stuff that I study is an interventionist or counterfactual account of causation. That's going to be, yeah, the dependence type here. Regularity accounts are accounts that suggest that regularities, finding a regularity means that you found a causal relationship. Constant conjunction is also how this is referred to. Necessary and sufficient conditions are sometimes associated with this, the logical relations of necessity and sufficiency. Hume, Mackey, Rothman, and epidemiology do work that relies on a regularity account of causation. Production involves an account of causation that suggests physical connection is the character and defining feature of causality. So you need the physical transmission, or you need the transmission of a mark. And there's a lot of philosophical analysis of what a mark is, but physical connection is a rough way to capture that type. So it's not just co-occurrence of one thing after the other, it's watching the physical transmission of a mark. And then the third, the dependence, is a counterfactual relationship. But for causation and legal context is similar to this. And to me, it well captures experimental design. What it means on a dependence account is that X is a cause of Y if an intervention on X that changes its values gives control over Y. So if you intervene on a gene and change it, you knock it out, you change its state, this gives you control over the disease, right, of interest or some kind of trait. If it meets that feature, then you have a causal relationship, or at the very least, a minimal standard to meet for a dependence account or an interventionist account is that the cause gives you control over its effect under an intervention.
A lot of the schematics that we use in biology and the ones that you've used in your talk have this like baked in assumption of thinking of time in a linear way, right? A causality over time, and that's the baked in feature of causality. But a lot of what we experience in neuroscience and biology has this like circular feature to this time relationship, right? The chicken and egg problem. And how do we think about that? And how does your framework help thinking about that like complex temporal dynamics?
Can you tell me a little bit more about the chicken and egg type problem that shows up, or the
I guess I'm thinking of, for example, there's a lot of bottom up versus top down relationships in neuroscience, or like things don't affect each other only forward in time, but then they, you know, this sort of feedback that you alluded to. So I was just kind of thinking about how to
think of that in this framework?
yes.
Yeah, so the way that this is understood in an interventionist account of causation is right, and this shows up kind of explicitly in different accounts. Your cause is something that should precede the effect. And I think there are lots of questions about whether your intervention is intervening on just your candidate cause and not also the effect at the same time, such that you can see a kind of difference in them over time. One worry we have with top-down causation, and sometimes even bottom-up, is just that the two variables of interest, your candidate cause and candidate effect, are not distinct enough such that it's even possible to change one first without changing the other at the same time. So there are various assumptions with this framework. Typically it is that you perform an intervention first, that your cause and your effect, or your candidate cause and effect, need to be sufficiently distinct such that you can have a surgical intervention on one without intervening on both at the same time. And that after you perform that intervention, you later see the effect. If you have a higher level cause, right, sometimes there are worries that your higher level cause encapsulates a lower level effect. But yeah, those are kind of a few assumptions that relate to this. Nicole?
Thank you so much for this. Hearing you talk about this, sorts of things in my head. One of the things I really appreciate about your talk is the emphasis on communication, and I've never thought about how the bias is about information. That's absolutely fascinating space. But my question for you, or request, is to be put on a critical path, and I want to ask you, what is one of the biggest mistakes you see neuroscientists making today? Is it in the communication? Is it in conceptualization? Or what is the one thing that comes to happening with wonderful that like this overarching view of the field, but also depth of thought? What would you point to and say, like, you guys really might consider doing this thing better?
I guess I'll first say that the community of neuroscientists are quite good at being open to listening to philosophers. So I wouldn't want to pick on them in particular. And I don't find that they make problems more often than other scientists. And honestly, philosophers need to be very careful about how they identify scientists making problems. Doing excellent interdisciplinary work often means that you're, especially as a philosopher, it means that you're open to trying to understand what scientists do. And I come in with the view that what they know how to do their work very well. And I'm looking at the principled reasoning that underlies it. One thing I think we probably need to talk about to promote clarity in neuroscience and other scientific fields about causality is to figure out what definition we're using, right? What do you mean by causality? How are you going to go study it in the world if you don't have a definition? So just what's your definition of causation? What is causation to you? And this is a place where philosophy can be really helpful. Why? Philosophers have spent centuries, if not millennia, looking at counterexamples. And so, it actually is quite helpful. And they just spent a lot of ink on this question. That doesn't mean that all philosophical accounts of causation are helpful or useful. Some of them are, and they are because they pay attention to science. One of the biggest problem areas I see are attempts to define causation in terms of necessity and sufficiency. Yeah, I think we need to have a conversation about that, not just in neuroscience. And philosophers need to come to the table with a way to help facilitate discussions about what's meant by necessity and sufficiency insofar as their logical relations. They capture a regularity account of causation. And there's significant problems with regularity accounts, which is that they count some mere correlations as causal. So if you think of a common cause situation, air pressure causes your barometer reading to take on a certain value, and it causes a storm. The barometer and the storm are correlated. It might be that they're also necessary and sufficient for each other. They don't cause. So the way that you can break that is with an intervention. So really just what we mean by necessity and sufficiency. But philosophers need to do work to come to the table with a way to help talk about those relations and how we can and can't use them to understand causation.
Those are really fascinating thoughts. So I guess I wanted to ask you about, it seems like one reason that the definition of causation is important because it's easy, I guess, given definition, you can decide to apply it to data and decide whether you have a cause. And then it turns out it's pretty easy to get confused whether you have a cause or a correlation. So it was really important, I guess, to hear that definition. And you come with lots of examples of people made incorrect inferences or incorrect predictions, that's kind of factual. Seems like I might be playing around about this, but it seems less true for the secondary pieces of causation. Like you're not going to get confused about whether you have a past or sole cause usually. I mean, maybe so. I guess I'm curious if there are examples where people find it wrong. I don't know if the equivalent of like saying this is the causal intention for your correlation is for entities, but they assigned the wrong label to something and made wrong differences because they didn't really understand.
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. I agree. I think it is harder to assign causality. It's easier to assign these, but assigning causality is pretty tough in science. But one thing to mention here is what happens is sometimes scientists are studying causal systems that have material flow, or they study systems that have one of these features, and another scientist studies another system with another, and they think that these have to do with definitions of causation, with defining causality, and they worry that they have completely different definitions of causation, and they don't. It's part of what I'm suggesting. But these don't have to do with how you define it. So one way in which they matter is it's important to when you label these to know these. What role are these playing in how you define causation? I'm suggesting they don't play a role. So don't worry about communicating with scientists. Don't worry that you have different definitions of causation when you're just interested in these systems. They don't fix the definition of causation you're using. And I mean, there's not clarity on these types. Of course, scientists aren't often talking about these types in an abstract way. A nice thing about philosophy of science is I can look at material flow in one subfield of neuroscience, and then I can look at it in ecology, and then I can look at it in some weird field of biology, and I can see what's shared across those contexts. And so this just gives us a kind of framework for referring to these distinctions. But yeah, I do agree, they are easier to label than the causality label. Part of the suggestion is not just labeling them, but appreciating why they matter for explanation, control, and so on. Yeah, Michael?
You were sort of characterizing part of the talk as the value of, like, at an abstract level, talking about different types of causal structures. And so I guess I wondered, at a similar level of abstraction, can you characterize the types of evidence that you would need to establish this level? Something like that would be a way that this literature could guide, you know, part of empirical research. So your thoughts on that? Does the bow tie require one type of, you know, investigation or one qualitatively different kind of, you know, data than a loop system?
The way that I think about it now is that there are different methods that are best used for different structures. And so material flow is often a feature of some systems that have specific microstructural properties that sometimes scatter. For example, like a glacier, as it moves through a valley, the glacier has certain types of microstructural elements that have scattered along that path. So there's a different kind of evidence you can use to study causal systems with material flow if they release their material through the causal process. It's also the case that tracer and tagging techniques are a kind of method you can use for those systems and not others. Yeah, and there's going to be a number of challenges when it comes to positive feedback loops and using certain types of methods to study those. But yeah, the way that I think about it right now is in terms of methods, and there'll be more to say and think about with respect to different types of evidence for each of those methods. But yeah, right now I think about it in terms of methods that are either well suited for a particular causal system or off limits. You can't use it to study a particular type of causal relationship or causal system. David?
So that was great. Well, framework, definitely an ally, but I'm going to ask you a hostile question. So you have claimed that these distinctions don't matter for an analysis of causation. I'd like to push back against that. I actually think you're right, but I'd like to push back. Why think that these are orthogonal? Can't we be causal pluralists? Can't we be Cartwright sort of approach to causation? And wouldn't the pluralism threaten the distinction between primary and secondary?
Good. So causal pluralism is a very common phrase in philosophical literature. And what is helpful about this framework is if you say you're a causal pluralist, that could mean a lot of different things. It could mean you're a pluralist about the methods you use to study and identify causation. It could mean you're a pluralist about the definition of causation, or it could mean you're a pluralist about the distinctions. So this is important because it shows you what kind of causal pluralist you could be, and we need to keep these separate. I am not a causal pluralist when it comes to defining causation, at least usually not. If you're a definitional pluralist, you think there's more than one correct definition of causation. If you're a definitional monist, you think that one of these is the best way to understand causality. If you're a methodological pluralist, you think there are many methods we can use to study causation. If you are a secondary feature pluralist, or if, right, what's the word for this? Structural pluralist, then you think that there are important distinctions within causation. So yeah, it doesn't even make sense to say you're a causal pluralist without saying what kind you are. And we need this to say what kind we are, because sometimes these get jumbled together. Sometimes scientists or philosophers say, hey, some causes are fast, others are slow. I'm a pluralist about causation, and this is what they think about, because this is the type of causal pluralism that gets a lot of the attention in the literature. This is a really important type, and it doesn't get that much attention at all. So before you can even say what kind of causal pluralist, well, for causal pluralism to mean anything, you need to tell me what you're a causal pluralist about. And there are different meanings that get jumbled together in ways that cause confusion. This is a way to untangle them. Any other pushback on that, or, okay, good, okay, good.
President, last question.
Mhm.
Biggest buzzword right now in brain research, I would argue, is emergence. Where does that fit into your, where can we spot that?
Yeah, downward causation. So emergence has an air of mystery for some people, same with downward causation. The way that I think about emergence is that it captures causal relationships and causal systems that you can see at higher scales and that you can't see as well when you include more lower level detail. So these causal topologies are higher level causal structures, and you can say things about the behavior of the system without knowing the lower level mechanisms. In fact, you don't want to include the lower level mechanisms because they differ wildly across different systems that have these topologies. And yeah, so the way that I think of higher level causal systems and structures, like causal topologies, is that they're autonomous from the lower level details and they kind of emerge from them in the sense that you can't capture important features of the system if you start to try to include lower level detail and information. In some ways, it pushes back on reductive notions of explanation and understanding, or something like mechanism, where you need lower level detail to explain something at a higher level. If you look at these causal pathways, even like glycolysis, there is a mechanism that can function at a given step, but if you want to explain glycolysis across all organisms or a conserved pathway across many even tissues in our body, the mechanisms differ at even the same step. They differ entirely across tissues. So you can't include them if you want a general explanation because they differ. But that higher level structure emerges from those details and captures what is shared and what allows you to unify the systems and explain in those cases.
Okay. Send me an email. I think I sent you an email too.
Oh, absolutely.
So important.
All right. Yeah, should I close it? Okay. Thank you. Yeah.